Funding for Frontline is provided by the Park Foundation, committed to raising public awareness. Frontline is made possible by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
Tonight on Frontline, it was the year the war was won.
Freedom's untidy, and free people are free to make mistakes.
And the year the war began.
The insurgency turned out to be bigger than we had expected.
There's a war going on inside the administration that they don't even agree what they're doing in Iraq.
We can't say what would have happened if we had gone into Iraq with a clear plan.
Tonight on Frontline, the lost year in Iraq.
It was a lost year.
It's the year that we would love to forget.
The United States dug itself a pretty deep hole in Iraq.
The year began on April 9th, 2003.
The Iraqis had gathered around the statue and were throwing their shoes at it.
What struck me was the Iraqis couldn't pull it down themselves.
It was obvious it wasn't going to happen. It would be a pretty anticlimactic moment if we didn't help.
It was a dramatic moment. It was an American flag that went on at first. That's almost a metaphor for what's happened since. You know, and then ultimately, well, an Iraqi flag was put on it. And enough photographs were taken of Iraqi cheering.
By the way, the statue was very heavy. The problem was much more involved than I think anyone thought of.
It made me worry. Something told me, you know, this isn't going to be quite as easy as we thought.
It took only 3 weeks for Baghdad to fall.
People were just pure exhilaration. At that point in time, you think this might just work. We have an opportunity.
Thank you very much.
And I remember seeing a guy was carrying a huge couch on his back, and he turns and says, "Yay, America!" You know,
The Americans, hoping to be seen as liberators, would be challenged within hours when the looting began.
All of a sudden, the Iraqi people started looting, attacked the ministries, basically created a series of events which didn't stop with that. Less than 2 U.S. brigades were in isolated positions in a city of more than 5 million people, having no idea of what might come next.
The posture of the forces was a certain tolerance of this looting. They didn't come to Baghdad to shoot poor Iraqis who were trying to steal a carpet or a piece of furniture.
There was a great reluctance to kill Iraqis, which is what it would have required. You had this sense that we were the liberators, and this was a very conscious sense of identity for the military. Liberators.
The looting, of course, you know, went from the spontaneous looting of ministries. It pretty soon got into the homes, the neighborhoods, the shops. It then became carjackings and kidnappings and unstructured crime, then organized crime, and you could even probably do a DNA chain to the insurgency. That was the spark.
Iraqis are looting on a grand scale. It is a clear sign that while war might be ending, there is trouble ahead.
Freedom's untidy, and free people are free to make mistakes and commit crimes and do bad things. They're also free to live their lives and do wonderful things, and that's what's going to happen here.
We were totally unprepared to secure the city, to secure the surroundings. We neither anticipated the mission nor had the troop strength.
It was with a great deal of despair that I watched the apparent paralysis of the American command, the absolute lack of understanding of what was happening, or any effort to get it under control.
The Pentagon had spent more than a year preparing for the war. But it was only 8 weeks before the war began that Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld hired a retired Army general to handle post-war Iraq.
Everybody was focused on the war. They were focused on regime change. And that took all of their energy. And so I wasn't a central focus of them at that time because the spotlight wasn't on me yet.
When General Garner arrived at the Pentagon, there was no plan and no staff. And when he began to hire one, he walked into a political buzzsaw.
I was very surprised at how bitter and nasty the relations were between state and DOD. It was not one of differing views to serve the president. It was a full-scale war.
On the one hand, the Vice President's office and the Pentagon, on the other hand, the State Department, really didn't trust each other on Iraq. Garner was told again and again, get these state people off the team, get Pentagon people, that is, loyalists, on your team.
Anytime you have the clash of titans and you're caught in the middle of that, there's somewhat of a problem.
Garner put together a team that Rumsfeld would accept. But that wasn't the end of his problems.
We didn't have structure. We didn't have plan. We didn't have money. I'm not quite sure. We had a lot of will and enthusiasm.
The guy who would be told to be in charge of the Ministry of Industry and Minerals, literally had no information about that. There was no briefing book for him, no other government resources brought to bear. He spent his days surfing the web trying to find things and eventually took to sort of reading poetry and ordering books online.
In the first week, as the looting verged on chaos, as one ministry building after another was being destroyed, General Tommy Franks made his first triumphant visit and a surprise announcement.
Very striking thing happened. General Franks gave guidance that his commanders should be prepared to withdraw all American forces except for a little more than a division, which would remain, by September 2003.
Franks was telling more than 110,000 troops to get ready to leave in the next 4.5 months. A division, about 30,000 troops, would be left to occupy Iraq.
There was this power vacuum. Nobody quite knew what was the plan. The soldiers thought they were all going home.
Early the next week, when J. Garner entered Iraq, he began his mission by appearing in a series of photo ops.
Nobody told Garner, this is what we're going to do. So Garner was just sort of flailing around.
Garner worried Iraq was on the verge of spinning out of control. He decided it needed its own government right away. He surprised Washington by beginning to plan elections.
I did immediately start talking to them about elections. Let's get elections started. Let's start writing a constitution. Let's get a leadership group here. Let's transition, if we can, let's transition that into interim government. Let's start handing over functions back to the Iraqi people, et cetera, yeah.
At the White House, National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice, who had been marginalized by Rumsfeld, began to worry that he had lost control of Garner and Iraq.
Of course, this freaked out people in Washington. Now, this wasn't the plan. And so Garner starts sort of calling audibles on the field. He starts making it up as he's going along.
The White House had expected to quickly liberate Iraq, hand it over, and leave. But now Garner seemed to be off the reservation. Don Rumsfeld acted.
There's an absence of authority, a vacuum of authority.
Well, I was contacted by two people, Paul Wolfowitz and Scooter Libby, who was the Vice President's Chief of Staff, who asked if I would be interested in being considered to go over and run the coalition provisional authority.
In L. Paul Bremer III, Rumsfeld saw a solution to his problems. A businessman, a diplomat, managing director of Henry Kissinger and Associates.
Here's a guy who would work for Henry Kissinger, but doesn't know a whole lot about the Middle East, doesn't speak Arabic, doesn't know the region.
What he lacked was the practical experience, and it was that lack of experience that commended him in large measure to the Bush administration.
Given where the Bush administration was coming from, these apparent lack of qualifications was seen as a plus, because he didn't have the Middle East mindset of the State Department, and he wasn't contaminated by the Clinton-era thinking. But there were really huge gaps in his resume.
Bremer would have a couple of weeks to get up to speed. A crash course in Middle Eastern politics, economics, and religion. In Iraq, Garner and his team knew nothing about Bremer being hired. They were just moving into Saddam's shattered Republican palace.
I get back in the palace, and it's kind of in shambles, and they're all trying to find a place to sleep, and there's no bathrooms, there's no running water or anything. It was a mess. And the phone rings, and I pick it up, and it's Secretary Rumsfeld. And he said, "Hey, I'm calling just tell you what a great job you're doing. It looks like things are really moving, and watched everything going on, and just keep up the good work and all that. And by the way, I want to let you know that today the president chose Jerry Bremer to be his presidential envoy, and he'll be coming over there." And he said, "I don't know when the president's going to announce that, but it could be today, or it could be tomorrow, it could be next week." And so that was that. So I guess, the first day I got to Baghdad, I was lame duck.
And then you come across clusters of people looting, but they're not looting stores, they're looting government ministry buildings.
In Washington, Bremer was looking for a big idea he could bring with him to Iraq.
It was a bit of a kaleidoscope. There were only 2.5 weeks there, so it was pretty intense. I don't remember all the details, but there were certainly a lot of papers around, that's for sure.
Then, during briefings with the top civilian leaders in the Pentagon, Paul Wolfowitz and Douglas Feith, Bremer heard an idea he could use.
I think they emphasized Germany and the occupation of Germany, and that both Paul Wolfowitz and Douglas Feith, the two top policy people at the Pentagon, both are members of Holocaust families who were deeply damaged by the Holocaust.
Feith and Wolfowitz drew parallels between Saddam's Ba'ath Party and the Nazis.
Indeed, Saddam Hussein himself openly acknowledged that he modeled the Ba'ath Party on the Nazi Party because he admired the way in which Hitler was able to use the Nazi Party to control the German people.
Feith had been working on a tough De-Baathification order. Bremer decided to deliver it personally when he got to Baghdad.
Today it's my honor to announce that Jerry Bremer has agreed to become the presidential envoy to Iraq. Selecting Jerry Bremer, our country will be sending one of our best citizens. He's a man with enormous experience.
We flew on the C-130 into Baghdad. The thing that was striking to us was the fact that a lot of the buildings were on fire.
Baghdad had been burning for 1 month.
There'd be buildings on fire. The fires would just have to burn themselves out because there was no fire department.
There was no government. There were no police. The army was gone.
As they drove into Baghdad, Bremer made a decision and promptly announced it to his new staff.
I did one thing that wasn't very smart, which was suggest to the staff meeting that I thought we should shoot the looters, that our military should have authority to shoot the looters, which they did not have at that time.
His point was you only needed to shoot a few of them to make that point, and the looting would stop.
This wasn't very smart to do because somebody on the staff immediately told the press that I had suggested shooting the looters, and we had a problem.
That day, I was embedded with Teddy Spain, the MP commander for Baghdad, actually the U.S. police chief for Baghdad. And I turned to him and I said, "Hey, Colonel Spain, I'm reading in this New York Times story that you're going to shoot looters." He says, nobody's told me that.
General Blunt, who was the commander of the Third ID, made sure that his soldiers understood they were not supposed to go out and shoot looters. They didn't want to start killing the population.
And I think one thing Bremer found out that day is that he had no command over the military.
And so ended Paul Bremer's first day.
He thought he was coming in to be the proconsul. A proconsul runs the politics and the military. He had no military command. He couldn't tell the U.S. military to do what to do. And they were at odds with him. They didn't like him. They didn't want to listen to him.
The military in Iraq was run by Don Rumsfeld. And he was determined to run Bremer, too.
He spoke to Rumsfeld. He was always speaking to Rumsfeld. I mean, at least daily, but it was usually many more times than that per day. Ambassador Bremer got frustrated with it. He'd call it the 8,000-mile screwdrivers, the term he used to use, where Washington was micromanaging everything we did from 8,000 miles away.
At Bremer's headquarters, the micromanagement was in evidence, especially in the hiring process.
It was this children's crusade, especially of former Republican campaign workers, White House interns, Heritage Foundation people.
They were vetted by the White House liaison to the Pentagon.
The hiring process involved questions that would have landed a private sector employer in jail. They asked people what their views on Roe versus Wade were, whether they believed in capital punishment. A man of Middle Eastern descent was asked whether he was Muslim or Christian. People are asked who they voted for president.
The CPA operation became an exercise in heroic amateurism, in which hundreds of dedicated, courageous Americans went and filled positions for which they had not the slightest preparation.
At the Ministry of Interior, there was a new staff person handling planning for the prisons and police.
But the plans counterpart, who I had to work with in the Ministry of Interior, was a 25-year-old. It's his first job after college. So I asked him, I said, that's pretty interesting. How big a plan cell do you have? He says, I have 4 guys. I said, that's pretty small. He says, yeah, but we're really tight because we're frat brothers. I had never in my life thought I would encounter frat brothers and strategic planners in the same sentence.
From the first day, Bremer went right to work. He decided that De-Baathification would be order number 1.
Bremer hadn't been there very long, literally a day, and these papers were coming out of his briefcase. I was in the office outside of the front office and began reading them and so on.
I'm walking down the hall and Ambassador Robin Rayfield says, have you seen this? She has a piece of paper. I said, no, what is it? She says, De-Baathification order. I said, wow. So I read it, and real quick there in the hall, I said, this is too deep.
He was very, very, very angry. And Jay's very personal. His head was, he was walking fast-paced all over. I could tell he was very upset about it.
I walked down, and the CIA guy, great guy, was coming across the hall. And I said, hey, Charlie, have you read the De-Baathification? He said, yeah, that's why I'm here. I said, well, let's go in and talk to the ambassador.
Garner had briefed Rumsfeld on De-Baathification. He had briefed Condi Rice on De-Baathification. And he had, I thought, a fairly cold-hearted but realistic assessment, which is the Baathists are an Iraqi problem, and more or less let the Iraqis take care of it. They know who the really bad guys are, and they will kill them. And he was pretty content to let that happen.
So we went in and we talked to Ambassador Bremer for a few minutes, and I said, you know, this is too deep. I said, give Charlie and I about 45 minutes to an hour. Let us digest this thing, and then let us recommend some changes to you, and come back here and we'll get on the phone with Rumsfeld and see if we can't soften this a bit.
And Bremer kind of says, look, you don't understand. I'm not asking you. I'm telling you this is what I'm going to do. I'm not asking for your advice. And they argue a bit more. And finally, Bremer says, look, I have my orders. This is what I'm doing. And so I said, well, Charlie, what do you think? And to the best of my memory, Charlie said, well, if you do this, you're going to drive 30 to 50,000 Baathists underground by nightfall, and the number's closer to 50 than it is 30.
He may have come in and spoken to me at great length about it. I just don't remember it, honestly don't remember it.
You don't remember these guys coming in and saying, this is
Doesn't
30
mean
to
it didn't
50,000 people, and my God, what are you doing?
I just, yeah. You know, I was working 20 hours a day in that period as well, and this wasn't the only thing on my list of things to do the first 5 days I was there.
But this is a big one, right?
There were a lot of big things that first 5 days. There were a lot of big things the first 48 hours, so I don't remember every meeting. I don't say it didn't happen. I knew there were concerns. I knew the agency made the assessment that there were about 20,000 people to be thrown out of work, and I judged in the end that that was a risk we were willing to take. And those who were on high before, in particular the Baathists, who used their power to repress the Iraqi people, will be removed from office. I will issue an order on measures to extirpate Baathist and Baathism from Iraq forever. We have and will...
I think, frankly, there wasn't a single person in the CPA who understood what Order Number 1 meant. It created a climate where people could be expelled as university teachers or grade school teachers, not simply people who had some kind of tie to the senior structure.
You have to recognize that the vast majority of Baathists in Iraq were Baathists because that got them more money. I think the teachers were the best example. If you were a non-Baathist teacher, you made X amount of dollars. If you were a Baathist teacher, you made 4 times that amount. So for common sense would dictate, I'm going to be a Baathist.
2 reasons we wanted to keep the Baathist Party intact. One, the only folks have experience running the government, so we needed to keep them. Number 2, the Sunnis need to have a voice. And if you don't give people a voice, they have relatively few options. And what the Middle Eastern history and Middle Eastern, what it tells us is their next option is violence.
With the De-Baathification order, Bremer made his decisive statement. In doing so, he gave the CPA staff, the military, and the Iraqis the first glimpse of who he was.
Tough, could get things done. Anybody who was Henry Kissinger's right-hand man had to have a certain amount of steel in his personality.
After Bremer got into Baghdad, Colin Powell was meeting with Henry Kissinger. And Powell asked Kissinger, so Henry, can you tell me a little bit about Jerry Bremer's management style? And Kissinger snorts and says, he's a control freak. And if Kissinger, who was a legendary control freak, be calling somebody else a control freak, well, to Powell this meant that Bremer was a control freak without parallel.
And then, 7 days later, another decisive and controversial announcement. CPA Order Number 2, the decision to dissolve the Iraqi military.
I think the decision not to recall Saddam's army from a political point of view is the single most important correct decision that we made in the 14 months we were there.
It's described as the first step toward reconstituting this time, the policy had been designed by Bremer and then approved by the civilians at the Pentagon, Feith, Wolfowitz, and Rumsfeld.
We believed, Bremer believed, and I think the leadership in Washington believed, that it was very important to demonstrate to the Iraqi people that whatever else was going to happen, Saddam and his cronies were not coming back.
But the U.S. commanders disagreed with the civilians. Desperate for boots on the ground, they had been counting on the pacified Iraqi army to do the grunt work.
We actually had people negotiating with Iraqis to bring them back. And there were a lot of Iraqis saying, okay, we can bring back units.
They were clearly anticipating, at least as late as 9 May, of having available Iraqi forces for us to use in a reconstruction effort.
And the Iraqi military, waiting for more than a month to be called back, were equally surprised.
But it shocked many of us. And up to that point in time, I had these guys pretty much doing anything I wanted them to do. They were offering us forces. If we needed military police, I was told I could get 10,000 military police in 7 days. They could produce that for me.
Now you have a couple 100,000 people who are armed, because they took their weapons home with them, who know how to use the weapons, who have no future, and have a reason to be angry at you.
Who knows how many folks who got disgruntled and went to the other side. I will tell you this, 72 hours after the decision was made, the first major attack from the airport road took place. And had 2 of our military police killed. And it's been downhill from there.
At the White House, they were also surprised by the announcement.
The decision to issue an edict dismantling the Army is a decision that's made without the knowledge of Condi Rice or Colin Powell. They learn about it after the fact.
They are surprised because CPA Order Number 2 is different from what the president had agreed to after a briefing just 9 days before the war started.
The briefing recommended that the regular Iraqi army be maintained as an institution because we believe that it would be dangerous to put 300,000 men on the street with guns without jobs.
Now, in Iraq, the attacks on American forces were becoming more frequent.
We shifted from the Iraqi perception of us being liberators to the Iraqi perception of us being occupiers, and they resented that.
But surprisingly, just at this moment, the top military commanders began to leave.
It's a real sign of official inattention that almost the entire leadership of the U.S. military changes over. Secretary of the Army gets fired almost as soon as the war is over. General Franks retires. The ground commanders, McKiernan and the people around him, and Wallace, are gone, replaced by the most junior lieutenant general in the U.S. Army, Ricardo Sanchez, who until that point had been commanding one division of about 17,000 people, suddenly is commanding 150,000 troops.
Sanchez was not an inspired choice. And in fact, if someone had mentioned to you prior to the war that Sanchez would be the senior military figure in Iraq, no one would have believed it.
So across the board, it's almost like people are wiping their hands saying, great job, fellas. You know, you guys play the next game. We're out of here.
Sanchez and Bremer would both work for Rumsfeld. They would share the Republican palace and control of Iraq. It was not an easy fit.
Civil-military relations were a disaster. Everything from the top on down, Bremer and General Sanchez hated each other. They couldn't stand each other. They barely talked. Their interactions were stiff, they were awkward, and that sort of filtered all the way down.
By early summer, Iraq was becoming a very dangerous place.
First week in June, the military had been disbanded. The sheikhs were telling me that the insurgents were paying them money, paying them up to $500 per operation. If they could videotape to show that they had killed someone, they got a bonus.
It's got a military spin on it. Now you weren't seeing looting, criminal things as much as you were seeing grenades off of bridges, all types of things.
In Iraq, difficult work remains. Coalition forces have captured now some 32 out of 55 of the most wanted. They're making progress against the dead enders who are harassing coalition forces, just as they were unable to stop the coalition.
We refused to accept there was an insurgency going on. The denials from the very top of the Pentagon are absolutely stunning. Well into the summer of 2003, even when General Abizaid takes over and says we're seeing a classical insurgency, immediately the Secretary of Defense comes out and corrects him and says, no, we're not.
The area around the Republican Palace became known as the Green Zone.
The Green Zone became the Emerald City, walled off from the rest of Iraq. Rest of Iraq, electricity is intermittent at best, sewage problems, dusty, dirty potholes. Inside the Green Zone, it's calm, it's quiet.
But we always called it Groundhog's Day, because, like the movie, because we never knew what day of the week it was. Because every day was the same.
Life gets pretty good inside the Green Zone. The complaints you hear in the Green Zone are the cable TV channels aren't very good.
Every day at lunch, the pool would fill up with people sunbathing and stuff, and I thought that was kind of odd that they had time to do that.
The problem was a lot of those people never got out and confronted the real Iraq enough. You know, they came to believe that a flat tax is what a country with 40% unemployment needs, and rewriting the traffic code, and they came to, believe in that because they were so isolated.
I heard military commanders, some call it the Emerald City and others called it Oz. I mean, there was a real consciousness that the civilian occupation authority was a kind of facade, and that there really was nothing behind the curtain. That's why military commanders also called the CPA, they joke that it stood for can't provide anything.
In August, any debate about whether there was an insurgency was settled. It began with a car bombing at the Jordanian embassy.
August 2003 is when the real war for the future of Iraq began. August 7th, the Jordanian embassy gets blown up. A few days later, the UN gets blown up.
I am in Ambassador Bremer's front office. We get the news, and then we go into his office, and that's where things take off.
It was a very emotional situation for everybody involved. And I wound up doing these television interviews at the site itself. We will leave no stone unturned to find the people who did this.
With this new kind of attack, how can you secure the city and this country?
Just to do our best to find these people before they attack and to deal with them. And we will. Just clearly suggested a new order of magnitude of violence. I mean, we had certainly been losing soldiers and we'd been having some problems, but nothing on that scale.
1 week later, another attack, this time at a Shiite mosque in Najaf. Then coordinated attacks on Iraqi police stations. To the experts, it was clear America was still at war.
I knew for absolute certain when they had the series of bombings, the police station, the Jordanian embassy, the Red Cross, and the UN. That was clearly a campaign to drive out all of the elements that could help the United States govern the country.
Rumsfeld, angry, demanded General Sanchez deliver better intelligence about the growing insurgency. Sanchez pushed his commanders hard. Thousands of young Iraqis were swept up and interrogated.
It was their reality that, we had these dragnet arrests. You go into a village and just arrest everybody.
Bremer reopened Saddam Hussein's most notorious prison. General Sanchez's sweeps filled Abu Ghraib.
The biggest single tactical mistake was stuff Abu Ghraib with tens of thousands of Iraqis who may have been neutral about the Americans when they went in, but weren't when they came out.
Abu Ghraib and the other 16 prisons in Iraq became de facto boot camps for the insurgency. In early September 2003, Don Rumsfeld visited Iraq. He met with the generals and even toured Abu Ghraib. And he met with Bremer. It didn't go well. Bremer was worried about troop strength and security. Rumsfeld was worried about how long it would be before America could leave.
At one point, he said he wasn't sure that we had a sense of urgency about what we were doing. And I was pretty frosted by this comment. We were people there working 18 to 20 hours a day, 7 days a week. I thought that we were working very hard.
Rumsfeld told Bremer the Pentagon was growing impatient.
the policy side of the Pentagon, was saying the best way to cut all of this short is simply to hand over power to some Iraqis, find us some Iraqis, give them authority, we'll end the occupation, we'll get out of here.
But Bremer had no idea who to hand the government to. He had formed a governing council of various Iraqi leaders, but had no confidence in them.
And I told Secretary Wolfowitz, who was pushing this idea of early sovereignty, just handing sovereignty over, I didn't think the governing council was up to this. They couldn't organize a two-car parade. They were simply not able to make decisions in a timely fashion, or any decisions.
Increasingly isolated from Rumsfeld and the civilians at the Pentagon, frequently at odds with Sanchez, Bremer struck out on his own.
Bremer started out as someone who reported to Rumsfeld. But once he was out in Iraq, Bremer became his own Rumsfeld. He was in charge, he was the viceroy.
I think effectively Bremer didn't report to anybody. I mean, Wolfowitz told me flatly that Bremer ignored him.
Bremer devised a complicated 7-stage multi-year plan to bring democracy to Iraq.
Clearly, it was going to take 2 or 3 years and develop a constitution and have the constitution ratified and finally elect a permanent government.
Very few people thought we ever had 3 years, or even a year, or that we ever should have tried to completely restructure Iraq's political system who had any background.
Nevertheless, Bremer continued to refine his plan. Then he surprised official Washington by unveiling it in a newspaper.
Bremer lays out this plan in an op-ed piece in the Washington Post.
It was a surprise to people in the government.
That wasn't sent up to Rumsfeld. It wasn't sent to Colin Powell or to Condi Rice. He was his own man. He was the viceroy.
Now the White House decided to get Bremer and Iraq under control. The presidential re-election campaign was beginning. Bremer's 7-stage plan loomed as a big political problem for the president.
They don't want to be in the business of still occupying Iraq while going to the polls in November of 2004.
The task of reining Bremer in and taking him away from Rumsfeld would fall to National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice.
There was a problem. This National Security Council apparatus just was not very strong or particularly effective.
In the inner circle, Rice had been overmatched.
He came to this position with a remarkably strong outside group of leaders. Colin Powell, Donald Rumsfeld, Vice President Cheney. I don't think there have been many national security advisors in recent memory who had so many countervailing leading forces.
Then you combine the fact that the Vice President is really personally close to the Secretary of Defense, that they've been working together, playing together for decades. And you have the Secretary of Defense ignoring the National Security Advisor, not taking advice, not taking suggestions, because he talks to the White House at a higher level. That made it difficult for Dr. Rice, too.
Early on, it was difficult for Rice to sort of stand up to Rumsfeld. It wasn't until Rumsfeld demonstrated an inability to manage Bremer that provided Rice with the opening to go in and say, look, we got to bring him under my control.
In order to get the president's men under control, Condoleezza Rice hired some muscle of her own.
Well, I was ambassador to India. I was on my way back to Harvard, and Condi raised, who is an old dear friend of mine, as I think you know, and we'd worked together in 41 Papa Bush's administration. And so she asked me whether I would be interested in coming to the NSC.
At the State Department, Bob Blackwell and Jerry Bremer had been competitors.
Bob has a reputation for being a kind of no-nonsense guy, willing to crack heads, willing to call somebody an SOB, and I think he was kind of brought in as the muscle for the White House.
At the White House, Blackwell sifted through the cable traffic from Iraq and classified CIA briefing documents, and then he read Bremer's op-ed piece in the Washington Post.
When I read that, and given my reading and reflections, I immediately believe that we are not going to be able to sustain our position in Iraq on that 3-year timetable. I immediately spoke with Condi Rice and Steve Hadley about this, and we discussed, well, what is a reasonable timeline for this? And we decide that it is the following summer, that it is June of the following year.
Blackwell told Bremer they wanted him to hand over sovereignty by June 30th, 2004. But Bremer fought back. He wanted to thrash it out in Washington. He believed he'd been following George Bush's original marching orders.
In terms of Iraq, my guidance was quite clear. Let's see if we can get the Iraqis on a path to democracy, to representative government, and help them rebuild their economy, help them reconstitute their economy.
Now, having designed a plan and a multi-year timetable, the question was whether the president was willing to stay the course.
Bush doesn't like personal confrontation. He's unhappy with it. I think they'd much rather make the decision without ever saying it, really. And as I imagine that meeting between Bush and Bremer, I think there was a sort of sense of, you're doing a hell of a job, Jerry, let's go work out. Oh, and by the way, we're out of there in July. Okay, Mr. President?
It was the death of his grand agenda. That was the referendum on Bremer's plan, and Bremer's plan lost.
And basically the new policy is 3 words, we're out of here.
Then, being this extraordinary public servant, he saluted and did everything he could to carry out the president's instructions.
Behind closed doors, Rice would now do the talking to Bremer. Rumsfeld, who hadn't been told Rice had hired Blackwell, was now even more out of the loop.
He took me aside and said that his impression was that I was dealing with her and directly with the president through her on political matters. So, and I said, well, yeah, she's certainly very active in this thing. And I got the impression at that point that he was essentially going to focus now almost entirely on the security aspects, and the political stuff was going to be left to the, Rice channel.
7 November, go.
On November 15th, 2003, in Iraq, the Bremer-appointed Governing Council publicly announced America would hand over sovereignty by June 30th of the following year.
Then on November 16th, he meets with his senior staff. Now, do whatever you have to be able to get out on time. And it's the end of the vast American neoconservative experiment in Iraq.
Bremer, who runs marathons, was in a race with the clock.
He was constantly, I'd say he was even obsessed with the ticking of this clock and the need to get things done and get the resources spent effectively, get the activity going, the democratic activity, the economic reconstruction, the electricity, the water, the schools, with the days beginning to run out like sand in an hourglass, looking toward June 30th.
Bremer himself focused on 2 key goals: writing an interim constitution and forming a government, all the while presiding over a country at war.
What you also saw were the rise in the West of very organized insurgent efforts which were taking control of cities.
They detonated a bomb at the main entrance to the Green Zone. And all over Iraq, dozens of soldiers and hundreds of civilians were being killed every week.
The April-May period of 2004 was certainly the fundamental crisis of the occupation.
Bremer's agenda was hostage to the growing insurgency. He wanted more troops. Bremer pressed his case, and he found an ally in Bob Blackwell.
His views were that we need more troops on the ground, and he and I agreed. It was one of the things, quite apart from the pace of the transfer of sovereignty, is one of the things we talked about and agreed strongly about when I was out there. Jerry argued separately up his chain of command to Rumsfeld about this.
I did a number of times talk about the need for more troops. The consistent view was they had enough troops. I never heard them ask for more troops. So if you're the president, you have this guy on the ground who's saying, I think we need more troops. You've got all these military experts saying, we've got enough troops.
I was present often when the president made clear to Rumsfeld and Dick Myers and the military that he would abide by their advice with respect to the troop levels in Iraq. And I was there many times when he would say to them, and did say to them, you tell me, if you need more troops, you get more troops. But they never made such a recommendation.
In April of 2004, just south of Baghdad, the cleric Muqtada al-Sadr's Mahdi army had attacked American troops. And at the same time, up in the Sunni Triangle in Fallujah, 4 American contractors were murdered.
Dragged around and hung off the bridge. 2 of the bodies are hung off the bridge. This creates a we must do something response.
The president was outraged. So was Bremer. The impulse for revenge and to finally make a statement to the insurgents prevailed. Rumsfeld ordered the Marines to clean out Fallujah. The civilians, Bremer and Blackwell, agreed.
Marines understand an order. So they shaved off their mustaches, fixed bayonets, and went in, and did what Marines do the best.
The Marines ran into fierce resistance. Hundreds of Sunnis and nearly 40 Marines were killed.
We underestimated the ferocity and the skill of the enemy, and we didn't have enough troops. And we took very heavy fire, and we took casualties.
But within a week, the spectacle of heavy Iraqi casualties threatened to cause the governing council to fall apart.
Once it flies apart, there's no one to transfer sovereignty to. And we can't put Humpty Dumpty back together again in 2 months.
It was Bremer's toughest challenge.
He held it all together. He was managing a major armed conflict in Fallujah, a major armed conflict in southern Iraq with Sadr, a political process that was on the cusp of completely crumbling, all up against the deadline of us having to hand over sovereignty to somebody, while Americans, coalition forces, and Iraqis are getting killed. He's got to hold all that together.
And in the end, Bremer asked the president to stop the Marines.
I said to the president, you must understand, Mr. President, that the consequences of continuing there are very likely going to be that it's going to blow up this political process. And we're not going to be able to transfer sovereignty, and we're not going to be able to, therefore, get onto the election program for 2005.
The president, having set the goal of disengaging from Iraq by June, agreed with Bremer. The Marines were ordered to pull out of Fallujah.
The same guys who had, a couple of weeks before, who had wanted blood, saw a lot of blood. And Bremer was one of them. And quite frankly, they realized what they'd done. So they told the Marines to stop.
Then, Abu Ghraib.
A very senior cleric had told me about it. He had said that there were abuses at Abu Ghraib. So I said to him, I said, look, I can't believe an American soldier would do such a thing. Bring me pictures.
The photos appeared in late April.
And then when the pictures came out, he sent a message back, was that enough pictures for you? So I'm very smug about it.
On June 28, 2004, under deadline, Bremer had pushed an interim constitution through, formed a new government, and handed Iraq back to the Iraqis.
Sincerely, L. Paul Bremer, ex-administrator of the Coalition Provisional Authority.
It was time to go home. But getting out of Iraq wasn't that easy.
The intelligence was suggesting that the terrorists and the insurgents were planning a major series of attacks on June 30th to embarrass us, make it look as if we were being chased out of Iraq, not that we were leaving on our own.
Fearful of attacks, he had to leave 2 days early. The road to the airport wasn't secure. He had to take a helicopter.
It says a lot about the security in the country by the time we did turn over sovereignty, that is the way that we had to leave.
It was sort of an ignominious departure. It was yet another metaphor.
The way he left, how he left, was the best evidence that what he had come to accomplish, he didn't accomplish.
I think on the whole, the American people can say we did a noble thing. We put the Iraqis on the right path politically to a better political future, and they now have got certainly the right plans to rebuild their economy. All that remains now is to effect a security strategy that defeats the Sunni insurgency.
We lost a good deal of ground. Once the Iraqi people were at least open-minded and prepared to work with the United States and optimistic about the future, and that has largely been lost and was largely lost over that first year.
On that last day, Bremer still had trouble getting out of Iraq. They were worried about surface-to-air missiles.
So we had to devise a way to get out that didn't involve a C-130, and we had to keep, of course, all of it secret.
For the cameras, Bremer appeared to leave on this airplane.
And we pulled up the stairs, and we just sat in the C-130. We sat there for about 15 minutes while the press and everybody went away, and then we went off out over the cargo that was in the C-130 in the back and flew on a helicopter to another part of the airport. And instead of going out on a C-130, went out on a government plane, smaller government plane, to Jordan, safely.
It's been another spasm of violence in Iraq.
Chaos returned with a vengeance.
14 young men abducted, tortured, then shot dead.
It's possible that Iraq could move towards civil war.
Insurgents have stepped up their attacks since an interim Iraqi government was installed late last month.
This report continues on our website. Watch it again online in high-quality video. Explore a chronology of the decisions, mistakes, and daunting realities during that first post-war year in Iraq.
He starts making it up as he's going along.
Read extended interviews with key officials and observers.
He had no command over the military.
Explore more about the policy disputes, personality conflicts, misjudgments, and missed opportunities. Then join the discussion about this report at pbs.org.
Funding for Frontline is provided by the Park Foundation, committed to raising public awareness. Frontline is made possible by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.